Heat check. Basketball, basketball, college. Basketball, basketball, college. Oh, is that time already? Whoa. Basketball.
Welcome into the brand new first ever Heat Check Hangout. I'm your host, Brian Rauf, joined as always by my co-host, Connor Hope. If you look familiar, it's probably because you're looking for the Hope and Rauf podcast. This is the rebranded version of that Heat Check Hangout. We're bringing to you a video element and something we've worked hard at this offseason to bring to you guys. And the format, we wanted it to be more of a hangout. Riley Davis, another writer for Heat Check CBB, Field of 68, is going to be a consistent contributor to this as well. A third co-host, he'll be on here a good majority of the time. We're also going to have a good amount of guests coming in, a couple per episode maybe. Rotating cast that comes through. It's going to be more of a hangout than me and Connor talking to each other and you listening. That's what we wanted it to be. It's more than just us two. And so we are now the Heat Check Hangout. Connor, it's exciting to be back. I know we've had a bit of a long layoff here. Not the worst time in college basketball to do that, but I'm excited to get back going.
Yeah, no, this is just part of a lot of very exciting developments that we're planning to bring this season at Heat Check. I know there are quite a few that are yet to be announced, and I'm not going to spoil them here, but we've been excited. This has been an idea that we've thrown around the last season, and considering our ability to throw up these videos and improve the rotation of guests and increase the rotation of guests that we have on this podcast, I think that people are going to be really happy with the content that's going to be put out. And we're going to try and cover, like Heat Check does, some of these less covered teams. Mm-hmm. So you might not get coverage from some of the teams or some of the coaches that we bring on anywhere else. And that's what we're hoping to do moving forward with the Hangout, as opposed to what we were doing with Hope and Rauf, which was a little bit of a smaller production.
Yep, we will have coaches, we will have players when possible. We will have other media members. It's going to be a hangout to talk all things college basketball, not just at the top level. You will still hear a lot of us talking about if Indiana is overrated, can UNC win the national championship, John Shire at Duke, how that's going to go. But you also hear us talk about some of the mid-major conferences as well. I know that's one of the reasons why you all like Heat Check and hopefully like what Heat Check Hangout will be and like Hope and Rauf, as well as that we're looking at college basketball as a whole and not just the power conferences, even if that's what college basketball ends up being in a few years. But that's not something we're going to discuss now. We have a bit of a crossover between the mid-major ranks and power conference ranks we need to discuss first, Connor, because the big college basketball news is the Kentucky Gonzaga home and home, quote-unquote home and home, that they announced. Everyone was very excited about it. People were giving Kentucky, I think in particular, a lot of credit because they were going to be traveling across the country this year to go play at the Kennel. And Gonzaga is making the return trip next year in the 2023-24 season. Turns out they're probably not going to the Kennel. It'll be played at Spokane Arena, which kind of loses the luster of going to play Gonzaga at Gonzaga. You're still playing Gonzaga, still playing a really good team, going to be likely a preseason top 10, top 15 matchup. Still going to be a really fun game to watch. But the fact that it will not be at the Kennel, I think it certainly loses a lot of its luster.
Yeah, and frankly, I think having it at Spokane Arena, where the Spokane community can actually go to the game, still makes it a really intriguing game for sure. The difference between Spokane Arena and Key Arena in Seattle, which is obviously where Gonzaga played Alabama last year, from the perspective of the number of fans that would be there and maybe the home environment for Gonzaga, probably marginally different. Obviously Spokane allows that Spokane community really to attend that in a way that Seattle did not. But you do lose something by not being in the Kennel, right? In the Kennel, that student section spans the entire sideline of one of the sidelines, 3 to 4 feet off the floor, right on top of the opponent. Spokane Arena is an arena football hockey arena. Rodeos are there. the stands are further off what would be the floor for a basketball game, which is conducive to holding, Spokane Arena's held multiple NCAA tournament games, especially at the women for the women. But even if Gonzaga were to give an entire sideline to the student section, which I'm not so sure that's going to be the case, given how highly anticipated this game is, they're probably going to be behind the baskets. You're still talking about 15 feet, 20 feet between the edge of the floor and where the first seats for fans are, separated by multiple, 1 to 2, maybe 3 rows of media. Like, you're talking about a pretty big distance between the fans and the student section in particular and the players. So huge game, huge development. It now leaves, I believe, Duke is the only team that hasn't agreed to travel to Spokane yet in its history. Kansas obviously hasn't been there yet, but they've at least agreed in one aspect to go there. Whether that will happen in the next 2 years or further on down the road after the potential Maui matchup next season, not this upcoming one, but the one following.
Yep.
I think it will happen. So teams are now willing to travel to Spokane. I think, assuming that this is what I think it is, which is possibly a way to raise money where maybe proceeds from the game go to the parts of Kentucky that really need the help, which is why it was announced at the event yesterday with the telethon with Cal calling Mark Few. I think more fans in the stands and obviously more ticket revenue is good for that. That can only help. It just sucks that that's going to be where Kentucky gets a taste of a Gonzaga home environment instead of, albeit only 6,000 fans, everything is right on top of the court in McCarthy Athletic Center, where it's just not in Spokane Arena.
The Kennel is one of the great environments in all of college basketball. I think no matter how you look at it in other places around the country, it's a top 5 atmosphere nationally. To see a program like Kentucky go into that is something that even a casual basketball fan, not even a college basketball fan, but a casual basketball fan, I think would be interested in and would be incredibly fun to watch on TV to see them in that environment. I get the sense that the reasons to move to the bigger arena, make more money, donate more money if that ends up being the case. Kentucky's probably hoping you get some more Kentucky fans in there because Big Blue Nation certainly travels well. But it's one of the things we're slowly losing, I think, in college basketball is the true home and homes. And that's one of the things that makes we're losing it in college football too. It makes college sports special are those home and homes and the atmospheres and the fan engagement and just the passion you see that doesn't translate over to neutral sites the same way. Doesn't translate over to semi-home sites like Spokane Arena is for Gonzaga. Doesn't translate the same way. And it'll still be a great matchup. It'll still be fun. It'll still be a good atmosphere. But it isn't what we could have had. And I think knowing what we could have had, it's hard not to be a little disappointed.
Yeah, and I think if you're, obviously if you're the players, you probably don't care. I think the one group it hurts is the students, in the sense that, the atmosphere for the students is just going to be different. There's going to be more fans. The fans are probably going to be louder because it's not all just season ticket holders who can afford to be there. There's going to be tickets available for some hardcore fans to attend this game. But the students just aren't going to get, especially this year where Gonzaga's best home game out of conference now is Washington. Like, they're just not going to get a good home game, and Kentucky would have been that. I think the students are the ones that end up losing out. But obviously, in terms of revenue, in terms of non-student, just the amount of fans that can be at that game, especially from Kentucky, because as it is, there's only, I think, 150 tickets in McCarthy that are dedicated to the away team. And so, Kentucky will be able to have some more fans there, which, might make it seem less like a Gonzaga home game. Not that it's not going to be. It's still going to be overwhelmingly Gonzaga, but it might just be a little bit less of the 5,850 to 150 ratio that you have in McCarthy. So still a huge game, though. Massive, especially given what Gonzaga has coming up this season. They have a very good string of games in the middle of November to beginning of December that they're going to go through, and before they reach the WCC conference schedule, and then everyone calls them out for having a weak schedule. But this is just
the annual tradition, unlike any other.
Yeah, I mean they play Michigan State on an aircraft carrier. 5 days later, they play in Austin at Texas. 4 days after that, they play in Spokane Arena against Kentucky. Then they have 4 days off. They travel to Portland. They play Portland State, but then either Purdue or West Virginia. And if they win that second game, which I think they should, they have the possibility of playing Duke. If it's not Duke, it's Florida or Xavier, which is still a great matchup, between two teams that should be tournament teams. And then right after that, 5 days after that, they play Baylor in South Dakota. And then they have a couple of weeks without really a tough game yet, play Washington at home. And then right before Christmas on the 17th of December, they play in Birmingham against Alabama in the second half of their pseudo neutral agreement with them.
Yeah. Gonzaga always plays a loaded non-conference schedule. It's going to be fun again. Kentucky has a pretty good one too now, especially with the addition of Gonzaga. The open with Michigan State, maybe not open, but first major game of the Champions Classic. They'll play Michigan in London in December. They have UCLA and MSG as part of the CBS Sports Classic. And then they get Kansas. It's in Lexington, but they get Kansas as part of the SEC Big 12 Challenge. Kentucky doesn't always go to true road games, and the Twitterverse has not so subtly pointed that out over the last 24 hours, but they're also not afraid to play those big games. They'll just play in the neutral sites and give both of these programs credit for challenging themselves and giving us fans those kind of games. But it could be, I think, a big momentum builder for whoever ends up winning that game, Gonzaga or Kentucky.
Yeah, and it's big for both teams because both teams have, their starting five returning. Obviously, Kentucky has Severe Wheeler, who's led the country in assists the last 2 years. And then Gonzaga brings back Julian Strother, Anton Watson. But they both have a really good group of young players. Kentucky, more freshman heavy, Gonzaga, more sophomore heavy, that are going to be looking to prove themselves. And if you can prove yourself that early in the season against what should be a top 10 team, possibly top 5 for both of them, it's going to be a huge momentum building win, especially going into the Thanksgiving weeks.
Absolutely. And, there was that 12-hour window or so where everybody on the internet thought Drew Timme was going to Kentucky.
Right.
So there's that storyline too. Let's get into talking about Kentucky a little bit here. We can talk about Gonzaga in this context as well. It's still a little bit early to really dive into full preseason projections and figure out roster breakdowns and project standings and things like that. That will be coming in the coming weeks leading up to this season here on Heat Check Hangout. But there are some teams that I know we're generally higher on or lower on than seems to be the consensus. And a lot of these, we'll just call them early polls because I don't think they're way too early anymore. I think we've crossed that threshold. Gonzaga seems to be a consensus top 3, top 5 team out there. It's fitting that we're leading off the rebrand with a lot of Gonzaga talk, considering that we spent the last 2 years as a Gonzaga podcast. Are you buying into Gonzaga this year as being at the level and potentially even maintaining the level that they played at the last 2 years? Or is this a team that's going to take a step back?
I think it's not going to be as good as it was 2 years ago, and I don't think there's really much opportunity for any team to be as good as Gonzaga and Baylor were 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a high bar too.
Yeah,
like it's not like you can be really good and not be that good. That's a historically high bar.
I think from an individual player level, maybe not even ceiling wise, but just an individual player level that we can expect going into this season, I don't think Gonzaga is quite there. Right? They don't have a top 2 pick in the NBA draft. They don't have one of the best pick and roll point guards in the country anymore. However, I think from a depth perspective, they're better than they were last year. I think they have the ability to run more versatile styles on both ends of the floor, offense and defense, than they did last year. I think their defense has the ability to be one of the best defenses Gonzaga's ever had when Drew Timme is off the floor. But I mean, if you run, Efton Reed or even Anton Watson at the 5, and then you run Anton or Strother at the 4, you have Salas and Dominic Harris at the wing positions, and then pick your point guard here. Like, that's a really good defensive lineup if they can buy into playing a style of defense that they haven't necessarily played much in the past, right? They're going to have to change from being purely man-to-man on defense in order to make that work. But what we've seen in college basketball is that muck-it-up defenses just win. And so eventually Gonzaga's going to need to try and figure out whether they can play that muck-it-up defense and still maintain that tempo and what they want to do on offense. So, I don't know if they're going to be as good as they were. They're not going to be as good as they were 2 years ago. I think if they can find a go-to wing or guard scorer to close out games, they have a ceiling that is a little bit higher than it was last year. And they should be able to win some of these close, tough games that they weren't able to last year because they were relying on two bigs who are excellent players, but aren't someone that you can put the ball in their hand at the top of the paint in a half-court set and expect to get their own buckets.
Hickman's got to be that guy, in my opinion. I at least think he's the most likely guy. Showed flashes of that potential last year. Was in a bench role because of the experience that they had in the backcourt. Figured to step in the starting lineup for Nembhard. My questions about Gonzaga, I do have them as one of the top teams in the country simply because Drew Timme's back. They have a lot of talent there, and I trust Mark Few whenever he's got a lot of talent. And Drew Timme might be the best player in the country, certainly on the offensive end. They weren't a good shooting team last year for a portion of the season, and you're losing. Neither of these guys were real knockdown shooters, but Nembhard and Holmgren were among their better shooters. And the guys they brought in aren't necessarily knockdown guys either. And you look at the roster, the strength of the team is up front. Everything's going to go through Drew Timme, as it should. Gonzaga's had teams like this before. They haven't always been the wide-open, free-flowing, guard-heavy team we've seen the last couple of years. But the play style is going to change. Or at least I think going to have to change if they're going to be at their best. And I just don't know how that's going to look. Part of that's because they're unproven in the backcourt. Again, I like Bolton as a secondary scorer. I like Malachi Smith being back there. I like Hickman. But we need to see Smith produce at a high level at this level of competition consistently. And we need to see the same thing from Hickman. Can you turn those flashes into consistent production? A lot of teams face those questions whenever there's turnovers, so that's nothing new. But when you're talking about the teams at the very top, I think they have a little bit more question marks than some others, and certainly that more than other teams up in that top 3, top 5 range. Again, I think they're going to be very, very good. I probably have them preseason top 10, but I think the floor for this team is still pretty high. I just don't know where the ceiling is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the opposite. I think the floor is probably lower than it has been the last few years. because I just think what we've seen from players, like there's no guaranteed guy outside of Timmy and you know, to an extent Bolton and Strother. Like everyone outside of that, you know, even Strother had stretches last year where he struggled.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right. Bolton was really the only one outside of Timmy that was consistently good, no matter what game you point to. I think the ceiling, though, I mean, the ceiling is what I'm looking at, right? If I have them, I think number 2, a clear number 2. Like there's a gap between number 1 and number 2 for me. But if I were to say who, you know, are they the second most likely team to win the national championship? Probably not. Like I'd put Houston ahead of them, who I have at number 3. I might keep Gonzaga at number 3 because you have the same issues, I think, with my 4, 5, 6, and 7 teams that you have with Gonzaga.
Yeah.
But Houston, to me, is the clear number 2, has probably the best backcourt in the country, and backcourts win in March. And North Carolina, I think you agree, is the clear number 1 team, best roster in the country, top to bottom.
Absolutely.
And probably has the second best backcourt in the country, if Houston's number 1. So,
yeah.
But the ceiling for Gonzaga, if everyone hits and if he is able to effectively use what could be a 9-deep rotation, I think the ceiling there is insanely high. You know, probably on par with, maybe a marginally below North Carolina. But I mean, North Carolina's ceiling is high as it is too.
Kentucky's another one of those teams that has question marks, but because they're Kentucky, because of the incoming talent they have, because the reigning National Player of the Year is back, Oscar Tshiebwe, there's hope that Kentucky can shake off that first-round loss to St. Peter's, which, shout out St. Peter's, had to wear it for the first hangout. There's a thought that was just a one-game blip, which very, very, very much may have been, and return to being the team that we saw really for February. They weren't so much this team in March, but in February they looked like the best team in the country.
Right.
They went to Kansas, the eventual national champions, and were up 20 in what felt like 2 seconds. I think there are people hoping that Kentucky can return to being that team. Their preseason top 10, because of those freshmen and some of the questions, particularly with how last season ended. I have concerns about Kentucky, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where you think the Wildcats stand, at least in the preseason.
Yeah, I'm not going to put much stock, into specifically that Kansas-Kentucky game. I just think that there was a lot both ways for that. Kentucky was playing really well. I think that was where you started to wonder if Kansas could be a national championship contender. And obviously then Remy Martin showed up. Bill Self allowed him to score, and the rest is history. But that Kentucky game, right? They lost to Kentucky. They lost at Texas. I think they got taken to double overtime right before that Kentucky game by Texas Tech in Lawrence. So it's tough for me to look at that one game and say, that's who Kansas or Kentucky is. I have Kentucky, I think 5th, maybe 6th in the country. I'm not too low on them. I've seen them as high as 4. But I think they have a lot of questions to answer, right? I think Xavier Wheeler clearly is a good choice as the starting point guard. You've got Tshiebwe at the 5. Everything 2 through 4 to me is just, it's a huge, what's going to happen? Is CJ Frederick going to be the CJ Frederick of 2 seasons ago? Or not 2 seasons ago, I guess 3 seasons ago, or the CJ Frederick of 2 seasons ago, where his production with injuries and stuff dropped off. Are there freshmen going to, be what we're used to from Kentucky freshmen, considering I think one is 12th in the country, one's 20th, in Cason Wallace and Chris Livingston. They
are highly rated, play positions of need on the wing, but only add to what Kentucky already does well.
Yeah.
They are long, athletic, good defenders. And I think Kentucky needs scoring, particularly a go-to scorer on the wing. I don't think Wheeler is that. We saw down the stretch, Shibwe, or really any big, can't be your go-to guy in clutch situations. You need that guy on the perimeter who can create their own shot and do so on a consistent basis. They're counting on one of those guys to become that. And anytime you rely on a freshman, a let's say, projected top 3 pick in the NBA draft freshman, that's a concern.
And look, I think Kentucky fans are gonna knock me for this, but like, how good really is Jacob Toppin going to be at the 4? And like, can Antonio Reeves?
Just like his brother.
I know Antonio Reeves was a really good scorer for Illinois State, but like, can he make the jump to the SEC and be a go-to guy? Like, that's what they might need him to be, and I just don't know if he can do that at that level. And so there's a lot of questions at that 2 through 5, and even the backup, or 2 through 4, and even the backup 1 and 5 that you're looking at going, they've got a really good tandem. You know, top 5 probably 1-2 punch in the country in terms of point guard big. But like everything else, it's prove it to me. And so I think 6th or 7th is a fair spot to have Kentucky until they do that.
They have a pretty wide variance in my mind because of that. I don't think we'll see a scenario like we saw 2 years ago where they finish sub 500 and the bottom completely falls out. But I also have questions if they can win the SEC. Yeah. I think they're certainly at the top of that mix, given what we know is coming back. But there are some things that have to go right for that to happen.
And I mean, to their credit, the top of the SEC is very much what's going to happen, right? It's not just Kentucky.
Yeah.
Arkansas, which Arkansas is going to show up? Is it going to be the floor or the ceiling? Auburn, can they win without their bigs? Can that backcourt actually win games? Yeah. Tennessee, I know they bring basically almost everyone back, but like, is that offense going to be the offense that showed spurts last year, or is it going to be the offense that can't score for 30 minutes in a game? Like, those are the questions.
I'm done with Tennessee. I'm done believing in Tennessee. I think they'll be a very good team, but I'm done believing that they can really make a run because their offense was so improved last year down the stretch. They crushed it in the SEC tournament and then got stuck in the mud. Like, they went from being stuck in the mud forever to figuring it out to we can't do this forever. And like, I don't care what Tennessee shows me during the regular season now. I know they're going to get stuck in the mud at some point. It might keep them from winning the SEC title. It might not. I don't really know. I think they'll play really well for stretches and then have a couple games where you're like, oh, yeah, okay. And I don't think you can win the SEC this year with those kind of games.
I mean, is anyone going to show up for extra shoot around before Javon Quinterly comes back for Alabama? Like, these are the questions that need to be answered.
Yeah. Is G.G. Jackson going to carry South Carolina to glory?
No. Let's touch on that for a second, because Field of 68 had an interesting debate. Rod Doster, and I believe Kevin Sweeney is in the same boat, though he wasn't in the conversation, very much think that this G.G. Jackson commitment and subsequent reclass to South Carolina is bad for Paris's first season as head coach.
Yeah.
T.O., John Fanta, I know Jeff Goodman's in this boat. I think you and I both agree. South Carolina doesn't need to win even if they have good players. They just need to start getting good players to go to South Carolina.
Yeah.
And landing the consensus, or maybe not the consensus, but the number one recruit in the country in the 2023 class is a good start to getting good players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Particularly one who's in state and in city, right? Like that's important. The biggest thing Lamont Paris needs is momentum, because South Carolina basketball program has had zero momentum, has had negative momentum if possible since that Final Four run in 2017, and they've been waiting for some sort of spark to get things back on track. Paris needed that, and this this certainly qualifies. Taking a guy from North Carolina, a local kid, and keeping him home, for lack of a better term, is a big deal. It gives that momentum. People are talking about South Carolina basketball. Nobody's talked about South Carolina basketball in a Heat Check Hangout, in a national space, in a Columbia radio show since 2017. It hasn't happened. So, like, the fact that we are having this debate and it's been happening for a couple of weeks now tells you that it's a good thing, because South Carolina basketball is on our minds. Yeah, they'll still be lucky to finish top 10 in the SEC. Like, the rest of the roster isn't that great, and Lamont Paris has a rebuild ahead of him. But the school knows that. I think the fan base knows that. The fan base that cares about basketball knows that. The part of the fan base that knows G.J. Jackson is at South Carolina and knows who G.J. Jackson is understands that he is not somebody who's going to come in and take this awful roster for the most part. Let's just say a rebuilding roster for the most part, and take them to the top of the SEC. He's not that guy. He's a very good player who is going to make South Carolina games interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if South Carolina got a win or two that is notable against the top 3, 4, 5 teams in the SEC. That wouldn't surprise me. But I think we could also see them again lose to some teams they shouldn't lose to. I think that's going to be part of G.G. Jackson's growing pains, because he's 17 and I don't think he's ready to consistently carry the load of the program yet. I think Lamont Paris is still growing into himself as a coach. It's his first Power 5 job. I don't think anybody would consider themselves a finished product the first time they got a Power Conference job or the job they're in and let's say wanted. But people are talking about South Carolina. The fact that G.G. Jackson was an in-state kid matters. One of the biggest issues that both South Carolina and Clemson have had in the past forever is that they weren't able to keep good in-state kids in-state. South Carolina, the state, has produced a lot of really, really good basketball players. A lot of them went to North Carolina or were plucked and went further down south, Florida, Kentucky. There was a stretch where they went straight to the NBA. None of them really played for South Carolina or Clemson, though, at least the best ones. And so the fact that he was able to do that with G.G. Jackson has created a lot of in-state momentum with other kids in the coming classes that now South Carolina has a more legitimate shot at that they did not before. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. If Lamont Paris doesn't turn out to be the coach that I think he is, and I think he showed, particularly the last couple of years at Chattanooga, he wasn't going to last long anyway. Mm-hmm. But now he has momentum that actually gives him a chance to succeed. I don't care that the spotlight's on him more so than now. Not enough people are going to care about South Carolina basketball once the bullets actually start flying for it to matter in a significant sense. So to me, this is a good thing. I understand the concerns about like the spotlight and stuff, but if you're a good coach, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and the fact that, like you said, the fact that people are talking about South Carolina, particularly South Carolina recruiting, when Kentucky, Arkansas, and Alabama all have top 5 classes, LSU, and I'm just looking at 24/7, LSU, Auburn, Vanderbilt, Ole Miss, Tennessee all have top 25 classes. Todd Golden is flying the media around in his private jet. Like, the fact that people are talking.
Why didn't we get a call?
I'm sure they gave the call to Eli and he just turned it down. That's the story I'm going to go with.
Probably. He was mad he left San Francisco.
But the fact that, like you said, the fact that South Carolina is relevant in what could be the best season, top to bottom and depth-wise, of the SEC is significant. And like I've been telling, a couple of times I've been on Greg Peterson's podcast talking about San Diego. It's not about winning. The San Diego hire of Steve Lavin wasn't about winning. It was about getting eyes on San Diego basketball. and getting guys to go play for San Diego basketball. And if guys are willing to go play for South Carolina and the media's eyes are on South Carolina and they're able to generate some semblance of interest to go watch their games at home in a season that is clearly the first year of a rebuild, like that's all that matters.
First year of a continued rebuild.
It's the first year, he's setting the foundation, right?
Yes.
The last 5 have been a steady, destruction, demolition of the program.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. South Carolina, I worked at a South Carolina radio station for 2.5 years while I was in school at South Carolina. It was not the university radio station. It was a statewide radio show that was broadcast out of Columbia, Sports Talk Radio Network with Phil Kornblut. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's where I currently live as well. Right in between Duke, UNC, NC State. Right, college basketball is a big deal here. I went to South Carolina and working in sports. Very quickly understood that basketball was a 2-month bridge between the time football ended and when baseball started. It's a pretty apathetic fan base when it comes to at least men's basketball. Women's basketball, oh yeah. South Carolina fans are crushing that. And I think we've seen that there's an appetite, particularly when South Carolina is doing well. The fact that there is interest, aside from that 2-month bridge, is significant. And I don't think people outside of South Carolina or people who haven't experienced that at other schools understand that just any eyeball is a good eyeball.
It's one of those things where the casual fan, and maybe some of South Carolina's fans who don't really pay attention to the rest of what's going on, might put undue pressure on Lamont Paris in year one because they have Gigi Jackson. But I think if anyone who actually pays attention, whether they're South Carolina fans or not, and sees this as a season in which South Carolina has to do anything other than be competitive above the bottom 2 in the conference, like I think that's unrealistic for the rest of the roster you have around Gigi Jackson, especially given the fact that Gigi Jackson isn't a wing or a guard, and so he's not going to be handling the ball a lot. He's not going to have the opportunity to make anybody around him better because he is a forward. He is a true power forward, and so I think there's going to be a lot of misconceptions around, well, certain players can drag their team out from that as top recruits coming in. And it's like, yeah, but those players are guards. And even sometimes when you have a guard that's that good, they're not going to do much. I mean, look at LSU with Ben Simmons, or Washington when they have Markelle Fultz. Like they weren't able to drag their team to the tournament. And I think their rosters were better than what South Carolina has around Gigi Jackson.
The one thing I will say, too, that's working in Lamont Paris's favor. South Carolina just paid Will Muschamp, their former football coach, a whole bunch of money to go away. It looks like new football coach Shane Beamer is doing well. He might be in line for an extension. They just paid Frank Martin a little bit of money to go away, which is fine. If South Carolina fans had their way, will be paying some money to send the baseball coach away. They also just gave Dawn Staley a massive extension, which she earned. And I don't know the specifics of Gina Oriema's contract, but she's at least one of the top 2 highest paid coaches in women's college basketball. They gave her men's college basketball title.
She's at least one of the top 2 coaches in women's college basketball, so it checks out.
Yeah. They gave her a men's college basketball type contract, which she deserves, right? But you're shelling out all this money to other places, and you just hired a new men's basketball coach in a sport that is 3rd or 4th on the pecking order at South Carolina. Might end up being 4th or 5th, actually. He's got some time. Even if Gigi Jackson doesn't work out, he's got some time. Let's shift to the Big Ten, because I think that's a conference that has a lot of question marks as well. traditionally has been one of the better conferences in the country, especially the last couple of years. It's been the Big Ten or the Big 12, which one's the best in the country. Top of the Big Ten's taking a step back this year. A lot of those teams that are projected to be at the top have questions. Indiana has some questions. I have an article that's up on heatcheckcbb.com right now. Thought how I might need to slow some of the offseason hype surrounding Indiana. But Illinois, I know, has a lot of preseason love as well. Some of the transfers they've brought in. Those two seem to be the consensus top two favorites, at least in the Big Ten. Michigan's hanging around there, though. Michigan State is always in the conversation. Different thoughts on Purdue without Jaden Ivey, Travion Williams. How do you stack up the top of the Big Ten? Is there anybody that you feel really strongly could take the reins of what seems to be an open door at the top of the conference, or someone who doesn't belong in that conversation that's currently there?
I don't think Purdue belongs in that conversation. And that's coming from a guy wearing a Purdue hat. Zach Edey, one of the best bigs in the country when he's on the floor. I don't trust him to stay on the floor longer than 20, 25 minutes. Whether it's fouls or, some of the issues he has with his, granted, for his size, really good mobility, considering the mobility that Purdue has had out of some of its other bigs. But some of the ceiling type of things, the limitations of Zach Edey's game, might force him off the floor at times. And he doesn't have that elite guard that can take the pressure off of him. And unless another guard steps up or a wing steps up and prevents teams from collapsing on Edey every time he touches the ball, like, he might score 20 points a game, but it might take him 15 shots to get there. And so that's one concern I have. The other concern is it related to that, and I've voiced this everywhere I can. It's become a little bit of an identity that I've had right now, is David Jenkins is probably the starting point guard for Purdue right now. And really good secondary option, really solid coming out of South Dakota State on the heels of the success South Dakota State had when Mike Daum was there. That's how long David Jenkins has been in college basketball. And at his last two stops at UNLV and Utah, he didn't really latch on as an effective top scoring option. But he might be the top scoring perimeter option that Purdue has. He's a good shooter. And as an off-ball guard, I think that he would be fine. But really, who does Purdue have other than Jenkins to run the point guard? I know they have Lawyer coming in, I believe, as a freshman point guard. But outside of that, I just don't see a point guard that Purdue has that can take that pressure off of Jenkins and allow him to be more of a free-flowing off-ball shooter. And so you're going to see a lot of iso ball from Jenkins that I think is going to do more harm to Purdue than good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Purdue is an NCAA tournament team. I think they are certainly closer to the bubble than being at the top of the Big Ten. I think the same about Indiana, though. I don't think Indiana is going to be a bubble team. I don't think they are going to be in that same conversation they were in this past year where it's like, you got to win this Big Ten tournament game or you're out. But I also don't think they should be the Big Ten favorite or be a team that I've seen ranked in people's preseason top 10s, top 15s. There's nothing they've done to back that up. Typically teams that we see that are projected to make that kind of leap and go from bubble team to preseason top 10 have young guys who showed promise, have put together a spurt, and maybe there was an injury or something that derailed them, but they got guys back who consistently played at a high level, and they're going to be really good. Houston falls into that category this year. Indiana has like half of both, right? Where they have guys coming back who and you know them because they've been playing college basketball for several years already, a lot of them together for a couple years. That experience was certainly going to help them. At the same time, we know who those guys are, and we've also seen a lack of progression from all of them throughout their college careers, right? Trayce Jackson-Davis is an awesome, awesome player. Really good big man, all Big Ten player. Going to be an All-American candidate this year. Wouldn't surprise me if he's on a preseason team. He's been the same guy more or less throughout his now going on his fourth year at Indiana. He doesn't have an offensive game outside the paint. He still really, really struggles shooting with his right hand. He's a lefty. He pretty much only either goes with the left hook over his right shoulder or dunks it, which he's had success with, but there's a reason his production consistently dips against the better teams Indiana plays. Just currently, the caliber of competition we expect Indiana to be playing at. I don't think he's suddenly going to turn into somebody who can carry the team. I don't think Xavier Johnson can be that guy either. Xavier Johnson was really, really good during that late run Indiana made. But that was a 10-game stretch, and he has played 4 college basketball seasons. This is going into his 5th. I'm going to rely on him being the guy he was the first 3.5 seasons and not count on him being that guy who was red hot for 10 games and that now being the baseline for his level of play. Race Thompson is a fine secondary player, but we haven't seen him really make an impact outside of a secondary impact. They can't shoot the ball. Miller Kopp was brought in to be their shooter, and he shot 37% from 3 last year, which is fine, but when he is your shooter, you need somebody who can be better than that, right? And these are all guys who are older, who aren't finished products, but I think any progression that we've seen, or any significant progression that we would have seen, would have happened already. And I know they're bringing in some highly rated freshmen. They got 2 top 30 guys. But they're, again, you talked about Kentucky questions because they aren't the top end sure things. These guys aren't sure things either. And we've had similar Indiana freshmen come in the last decade and not make the impact that they were expected to be. And that's fine because freshmen need time to adjust to the college game, at least a good majority of them do. The problem is when you were relying on them to play major roles for you to have major impacts. That's what Indiana is here, and that's what a lot of people are banking on with this team. They lack depth. They aren't a good shooting team, and you're counting on freshmen to make an impact. Those freshmen might be able to make an impact, right? Like Hood Schifino is a solid player, but I don't know if he is a top 2 or 3 scoring option for a Big Ten champion.
Yeah, I mean, they were a 33% three-point shooting team last year and lose their best shooter in Parker Stewart. So right off the bat, like, you have questions there. I agree with you. We kind of at this point know what Race Thompson and Miller Kopp are. Like, they're not going to dramatically change between last season and next season to the point where we can expect them to carry Indiana to the level that we expect from a Big Ten champion. I do like the Xavier Johnson, Trayce Jackson-Davis pick and roll, option, mainly because Trayce Jackson-Davis always seems to get lost in a pick and roll and then just end up with a dunk.
That was what I was going to bring up, is how many times you messaged me last year, like, just nobody's around him. He's going to the basket. You know where TJD is going, and just nobody would be there.
So, I mean, and admittedly, his athleticism for his size makes it really difficult, especially for other fives in the Big Ten to defend, right? You're talking last year, like, you've got big lumbering fives in Zach Edey or Kofi Coburn last year, or even Hunter Dickinson. Like, they're not incredibly agile bigs. And then you've got Trayce Jackson-Davis with a whole full head of steam running to the basket for a lob. It's tough to defend, right? So they have that. I agree with you. Hood Schifino, is going to be a solid starter for them. I don't know how much they can rely on him to be a shooter. Mark Renaud, is probably going to be a decent option, especially considering that Race Thompson is that kind of secondary starting four-man who is not going to be on the court as often, probably as Trace Jackson Davis. Outside of that, though, like Tamar Bates is maybe the only player that I'm looking at as, yeah, there's obvious room for improvement from him. Wasn't an efficient scorer last year, true freshman, but has the size, I think, to be an effective off-ball guard given a year of development in the program. But I'm not expecting him to develop into a star. Like, I'm expecting him to maybe fill, the Finney spot in the rotation, right? Like that's kind of what I'm expecting in year two. And that's not what they need. Like they just don't have that guy who's going to bring them significantly further than where they were last year, especially considering what they've lost in Stewart as a shooter.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. Let's move out to the West Coast to wrap things up here. I think there are Gonzaga's in its own conversation. We've already talked about them. I think I have my strongest opinions about a pair of West Coast teams, other than Indiana, obviously, about who I'm highest on and lowest on. The team I'm really not buying this year is Arizona.
The team I'm not buying this year is Oregon, but Arizona's close there, and the only reason USC is not there is because I think nobody's buying into USC.
Yeah. Arizona lost a lot. And Tommy Lloyd's an awesome coach, and we talked about it. You specifically talked about it before he coached a game for Arizona. You were lauding the hire, and I think we're more on top of that than a lot of people were. He's a great coach. They were certainly ahead of schedule last year, partially because they had some breakouts and some talent that was already on that roster. Ben Matherin's gone. Christian Coloco's gone. Dalen Terry leaving, I think, is the big one, because if he came back, he showed all the potential of being a superstar, potential Pac-12 Player of the Year. NBA guys saw that too. Obviously, that's why he's in the league now and was a first-round pick. But I think this roster needed him to come back this year, because you're counting on Kurt Kriisa to be that go-to scorer. You're counting on Pell Larson to be the go-to scorer. Can Tubelis be that game breaker kind of guy? I don't think so. I think Arizona will be good. Tommy Lloyd is too good of a coach, and there are still some pieces on this team, but I think they're that. I think they're pieces who need core players to play off of, and I don't think they have those kind of core players, or at least the core players who they identify and play those roles won't be good enough for them to be really in the mix for a Pac-12 title, keeping pace with UCLA and being a top 15, maybe even top 20 team this year.
Yeah, I mean, for Arizona, I'm expecting, not as a go-to scorer, I agree. Their take the ball and get a bucket when you need it in crunch time guy is not there. I'm expecting a lot of good things out of Courtney Ramey. You look at his efficiency 2 years ago when Texas played an up-tempo style of offense. He was great. Like, he was a solid off guard, did what you needed him to do, isn't going to be the leading scorer, but was consistent. Last year, when Texas slowed way down on offense, when everything started to get really packed in, I think that's where you saw Courtney Ramey start to really struggle. And I think that given the tempo that Tommy Lloyd wants to play with, Courtney Ramey can be a pretty solid, free-flowing three-point shooter, can be a consistent point guard during those moments where Kerr Kriisa struggles. He's going to be a 10-point per game type of guy, so he's not going to go for those 15 to 20-point games that you need. But I think the floor is there given the style of play that Arizona likes to play, given the fact that I think even if they don't get much out of the other bigs, just having Umar Ballo there with Tabelis is good enough. And that backcourt is good enough to be an NCAA tournament team. It's Oregon that I'm worried about, because while I think the ceiling is higher for Oregon given the pieces they have, like that floor could fall out just as well as it did last year. And are we like, is that Will Richardson at the one experiment ever really going to work?
No, I'm with you. Like, Oregon to me is a tournament team from a talent perspective. I don't think their ceiling is anywhere near as high as people think they do. Like, I just don't think the base talent level. I guess I'm lower on the base talent level than a lot of people are. I don't think the pieces are that good. I think they're fine. I think they're third or fourth in the Pac-12, fine. But that's not the highest bar to clear. Certainly not to be a top 20, top 25.
Like they're relying on N'Faly Dante staying on the floor, which I've quit believing in.
Which would be great for him, because he's been good when healthy, but I'm not counting on
Ware coming in and being an immediate impact as a freshman big, which I never count on. Right, so immediately their 5 spot to me is very, very iffy. Quincy Guerrier comes back. He'll give you solid amount. Will Richardson, we touched on, probably going to start at the 1. Keyshawn Bartholomew comes in, a good role player at the 1 or the 2. Jermaine Cusnard, like, again, we've discussed this before. Given the fact that he's not going to be relied upon as the guy, his efficiency could see a bump, but he was also every time you take someone that was the guy for a team that wasn't very good, and you try and put them in a position where they're no longer the guy for a team that may or may not be good, but has the talent to be good, like, it's 50-50 whether they deliver on what you need from them or not. So there's a lot of pieces that are coming together that really need to fit. And granted, Dana Altman, one of the best coaches in the country, probably top 25, 30 coaches in the country for that reason. But I just don't know if, for me, it's the Will Richardson and N'Faly Dante 1-5 experiment that I'm not buying into.
I'm with you. Cousinard is going to have games where he looks awesome. South Carolina transfer. But he's going to have games, too, where it's not clicking, and he'll force it even more. So he's not going to be the kind of savior that I think Oregon, I say savior loosely, I don't think he's going to be the consistent major contributor that Oregon needs him to be. I think he'll do enough. I think they'll be a tournament team. They'll have a stretch during the season, as Dana Altman teams do, where it's like, oh, okay, they figured it out. But I don't expect that to be a constant for them.
All of this is to say, though, that regardless of who we talk about, the best team outside Gonzaga on the West Coast is not in the Pac-12.
They might be the best team, including Gonzaga, at the end of the year. San Diego State. I am so freaking high on San Diego State. I got a lot of Mountain West, gave all my Mountain West love last year to Colorado State. Still very high on the Rams. I think they can surprise some people this year, even without David Roddy. But to me, San Diego State has legit second weekend potential Final Four team. I think they're going to be a team that has a season similar to what they were in 2020. That wouldn't surprise me at all. They're elite defensively. I think they'll be the best defense in the country by a wide margin. They were, I think, the second best defense in the country last year, if not the best. Matt Bradley's an awesome offensive player. They brought in Darion Trammell from Seattle, who we had on the Hope and Ralph podcast after his commitment. He is an excellent two-way player who is going to be the best offensive player that Matt Bradley has played alongside in his college career, either at San Diego State or Cal. They're going to take some pressure off of each other. They're going to have more offense to go with that elite defense. I think they will be special, and we'll get our first look of it at the Maui Invitational.
And like you said, I mean, last season they were top 5 in effective. I know I'm looking at the stats now. Top 5 in effective field goal percentage, top 27. They were 27th in turnover percentage on defense. Held opponents to right around 30% from 3, under 45% from 2. We're top 15 in the country in block percentage. And that's where I would have had San Diego State in the top 25 until Nathan Mensah returned. And returning that rim protection, especially to a team that's already as good as they are defensively on the perimeter, I think instantly boosted them up into I have them, right on the cusp of my top 10 right now. They're just a really good defensive team. And like you said, they bring in a couple of really good offensive options to an already great defense, where last year they finished 167th in the country in adjusted offensive efficiency. And we're still a team that finished as good as they did and got a 9 seed in the tournament. But you bring in Trammell, who's a great offensive point guard, can definitely play alongside Bradley, does a little bit of something that Lamont Butler doesn't do. You bring in Micah Parrish, who's a really good shooting option that just gives another dimension to that offense that they haven't had the past couple of seasons, or at least last year they didn't have. And so, yeah, I think they are. They might not have that instant kind of gratification type talent they had in 2020 with Malachi Flynn, who can just himself take over games. But they have such depth and such versatility this season, especially offensively, that they haven't had the last 2 years, that I'm with you. I think they win the Maui. And while we're on that subject, we can close close this discussion with Maui. Is the Maui Invitational this year the best annual multi-team event that we've seen in a few years at least?
In a few years, a lot of these tournaments have really good potential matchups. You talk about Maui a couple years ago, where it was that Duke Gonzaga, the Zion, RJ Barrett, Cam Reddish Duke team, but the rest of the teams in that field weren't quite up to par. Right, Battle for Atlantis has had some really good teams, but a lot of them it's been 3 or 4 really good teams setting themselves up for good semifinals or good finals matchups. This Maui bracket, which they somehow managed to do, by the way, with all the blue bloods outside of Kentucky playing in PK 85, managed to put together a bracket where all 4 games are going to be awesome in the first round. And no matter who wins or who loses, you're going to get a bracket full of excellent must-watch games.
I mean, there are 7, depending on how you feel about Cincinnati, 7 tournament caliber teams in this 18 Maui Invitational. That first game between Creighton and Texas Tech, I think might end up being the best game of the event, and it's a first round game between those two teams. Ohio State, San Diego State, I think is a little bit of a prove it. San Diego State, are you really that good? Ohio State, can you be a tournament team given what you don't have anymore, and the fact that you're going to be relying on a lot of young guys to do it? Cincinnati, Arizona, I think is sneaky good, given what we talked about with Arizona maybe not being as good as people think they are, and maybe a little bit of Cincinnati.
And this is Wes Miller's second year at Cincinnati, and he's a good.
That's what
coach.
I was going to say. Maybe a little bit of Cincinnati being better than people expect. No matter who Arkansas plays in that second round game, the winner of that Creighton Texas Tech matchup, I mean, that's also has the makings of an instant Thanksgiving classic. I would say it's probably San Diego State, Arizona, which lends itself to our, let's see San Diego State play all the teams on the West Coast and see who comes out on top. And then if we end up getting the masochist in me wants a Texas Tech San Diego State championship just because I love to watch the world burn.
Oh, God.
But if we end up getting a San Diego State Arkansas matchup, which is I think what's going to end up happening, or even a San Diego State Creighton matchup in a rematch of last year's NCAA tournament team between two teams that are significantly better than they were last year. That championship's going to be great.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at this Maui Invitational going, I mean, thank God Chaminade's not in it. Sorry. I mean, I loved that they had their little thing going on where they hosted it and played a game, and I think they beat Cal one year.
Yep. They have that. They'll always have that win over Virginia back in the 80s.
This, I mean, it's loaded down the line with the exception of Louisville, and it has top end teams too. Like Creighton, Arkansas, San Diego State, and even Texas Tech all have the potential to flirt with and stay in that top 10 through parts of next season.
Yeah. Was it Texas Tech and Tennessee last year that played the game at the Jimmy V Classic where like nobody scored for 12 minutes? Yeah. We don't need Texas Tech San Diego State just for the risk of that kind of game potentially happening again. But yeah, I mean the way they're able to put this on without North Carolina, Duke, Kansas, Gonzaga being in there, it's going to be incredibly fun. And I think if San Diego State wins that's going to, I think, draw a lot of attention. I wouldn't be surprised if San Diego State becomes one of those teams that goes from being like a fringe top 25 team in people's minds. We're certainly higher on them than that. We both have them just outside the top 10 to like an instant top 10. Oh, these guys are awesome kind of team. I think San Diego State really does have that
San Diego
potential.
State's a team that maybe on the road against Wyoming drops a game, but like they could have that run through the Mountain West. And not because the Mountain West's bad. Like Colorado State, even without David Roddy, I mean, they're not a tournament team, but they're still a solid enough team. I think the Lobos are going to be better.
Colorado State might be. Isaiah Stevens was not healthy in the last season, but I would put him up against any point guard in the country. He's awesome.
No, I mean, absolutely. They're still going to be a good team, but I think they're closer to the bubble than not. Wyoming, I think, should be good enough to get itself off the bubble this year. But UNLV, New Mexico they're not there, but they're on the rise a little bit. And then you've got Boise State, who's always a pretty solid team, especially when you play at their place in Idaho. But San Diego State is so good that like I wouldn't be surprised if they ran through that conference. I wouldn't be surprised if they won the Maui Invitational. I haven't looked at their schedule, but they could legitimately be in that same conversation with a Gonzaga or a Houston as, they're a 1 or 2 loss team at the end of the year. What do we do with them seeding wise? Because they played in this excellent Maui. They ran through a really good Mountain West. I don't think there's a feasible world in which all 3 go 2 losses. I think there's a feasible world where all 3 go 2 losses or less.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a feasible world in which all 3 do that and you do give them all a 1 seed. But I think all 3 are going to be in that conversation.
Good.
And you're going to see the world burn when it's those 3 in North Carolina as 1 seeds.
Houston sides in there as a 2 because they didn't play any top 50 teams or any quad 1 games, but don't have a loss.
Houston's non-conference is another issue. I don't necessarily think it's as bad as people are making it out to be. It's certainly not great. No. The fact that they didn't schedule themselves into an MTE is probably the one thing that I would nitpick on it. But
Well, about that, Kelvin Sampson said that they tried to, and they were in with an unnamed SEC team, as he put it. And once that SEC team saw that Houston was going to be in it, they backed out, and the MTE fell apart.
Well, there you go. But, I mean, if you look at their schedule, right, Northern Colorado, normally you wouldn't look at that and say, oh, that's a high-caliber team. But it gives them experience against a team with a top 10 scorer in the country in Dalen Kuntz that's at the caliber that they're likely to face in the first round as a 1 or a 2 seed. Oral Roberts still has Max Asmus. So they're still going to have, again, that player that you need to focus and key on defensively that's going to give them experience against that caliber of team come the tournament in the first couple of rounds. They play at Oregon, which is I'm down on Oregon, but playing in Eugene is never an easy game. Kent State, not a bad team, pretty okay mid-major. St. Mary's, again, down, but it's St. Mary's, right? It's Randy Bennett. That team's going to be ready to play against right. Houston. They play at home against Alabama, another top 25 team. They play at Virginia, I believe, or maybe it's a pseudo-neutral, I don't know. I think it's at Virginia, but Virginia's another top 25 team. So like this schedule is like, it's not terrible. And I think what people are pointing to is look at their conference. The American has not historically been a fantastic conference. Memphis, maybe Cincinnati are the two teams that you look at as, okay, those are quadrant 2, maybe slide into the quadrant 1 on the road type games.
On the road.
But I think it sets them up well enough to the point where, given the experience they have, given the backcourt they have, like it's not going to hurt them to go at this schedule.
No.
Even more so than San Diego State and Gonzaga. Like Houston may go undefeated this year, and I know that's tough. And I'm looking at Oregon and Virginia and going, okay, they probably slip up in one of those 2 games. And then maybe drop another one. But the fact that they don't have a ton of neutrals, and the fact that those are their 2 true road games, their 2 neutrals are St. Mary's and St. Joseph's, which should be wins. Like they very well could go through this schedule, dropping a game on the road to Oregon or Virginia, dropping a game on the road to Memphis, and still come out of this thing with both American titles, a 1 seed, and a really good shot at a national championship.
Absolutely. Final Four is in Houston this coming season. I've gone on the record. I think UNC is the best team in the country. I think they win the national championship. I don't think they lose more than 2 games all season long. I am more confident in Houston making the Final Four than I am.
So, and we can do a Final Four episode picks later, but like your ideal Final Four, given that the game is in Houston, what would it be?
I think UNC and Houston would be an excellent game. I would want to see San Diego State in there, just so I could tell everybody I was right. And then that 4th team, I think it would be crazy to see Gonzaga in there, because if you had Houston, San Diego State, and Gonzaga in there, that would be a lot of fun. And just the chance of Gonzaga winning a first national championship would be fun. Any other blue blood in there would be good too. If there was a Duke UNC rematch, wouldn't hate that. But to me, those are the 3 that I'm like, I want to see make it that far. I want to see UNC get back. I want to see Houston there in Houston, and I want to see San Diego State meet what I think their potential is.
Yeah, I'm a little bit different, just slightly. I want to see a Gonzaga San Diego State matchup this year. On one side of the bracket. I want to see Houston there. I want to see Gonzaga, San Diego State, because Gonzaga, San Diego State would essentially be, for me, the battle of who's the best team on the West Coast. But also because whether it is or it isn't Timmy's last year, like having him play in a Final Four in his home state, I think would just be like the perfect swan song if it is his final year. I'm going to go with Houston, and I'm torn on the other one. On one hand, I want it to be Baylor, because I think Houston-Baylor would be a good matchup. I like the way Baylor does it. I'm not going to root for a blue blood to ever make a Final Four. On the other hand, I kind of just really want Neptune to prove everybody wrong and be like, yeah, like I'm going to continue, maybe not at the same caliber that Jay Wright did things, but like you guys are looking at me like Villanova is going to fall off a cliff and we're right back there. Like we're still Villanova.
Yeah. I would love for it to be 4 like non-football teams. Just with the backdrop of all this talk about power conferences and there being like a break off from the NCAA, and maybe even some power conferences don't make that, but there being this break off, and then there's this big moneymaker that makes everybody all this money, and the Final Four is Gonzaga, San Diego State, Houston,
or like Creighton, or Villanova, like any Big East team. Insert best Big East team,
or any Big East team. Yeah, exactly. Like to me, I don't know if I would enjoy watching that the most, but to me, that being the 4 would be like
I think it would be
chef's kiss.
Considering what we know about the teams and the talent they return, like any one of those games would be really good games.
It'd be good.
I mean,
absolutely.
I think where you're gonna get the ire is, you know, TV ratings might not be as high, but.
Well, Gonzaga has been the biggest draw.
They've been the biggest draw, but if you look at those games, it's like Gonzaga in the national championship, Gonzaga against Duke. Like it's Gonzaga plus an already big name team. But it's going to be, I mean, if it's Gonzaga, San Diego State, it's that unstoppable force versus immovable object. Houston, Villanova, or Houston. I mean, Houston, Villanova would be perfect because it's kind of like the two. We're not mid-major teams, but we're not power conference teams, but we are national powerhouses in our own right, type of game. And then having a Gonzaga Houston national championship, I think would be just that would be to me the ultimate national championship game. I know you and I both have North Carolina as the clear number 1 team in the country, but I'm not necessarily rooting for the Tar Heels to get there.
I would for the only reason of me being right. And I find now that's what I root for more than anything else. Well, that'll do it. Thank you all for joining the first ever Heat Check Hangout. We really appreciate it. We'll be bringing these back on a weekly schedule. Certainly once the season starts, we'll be getting more and more regular as the season gets going and we get into some more concrete preseason content. I think we established ourselves, Connor, as a San Diego State podcast this year.
Only because we know that North Carolina is clearly number 1, and neither of us can do that to ourselves.
Yeah, we can't. It's no fun to be a UNC podcast, but
until Riley comes on, then we can put our flag in that right podcast.
Yeah,
but follow us on our socials. Yeah. We have a Twitter account that's already spun up. It's gonna be where you can find all the videos, clips, everything that we post from our podcast at the Hangout CBB on Twitter. And whether this episode is posted on YouTube or not is going to be a little bit iffy, but I promise in the next 2 or 3 episodes, we'll get everything set up with YouTube, and you'll be able to find our podcast there, in addition to where you already have it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, every other good podcasting service.
Thank you all very much for hanging with us as we make this transition. We're extremely excited about it. We think it'll be a lot of fun. We think it'll help us grow a lot in the future as well. Tell a friend. You got friends who are into college basketball and they don't listen to us and you think they should. Tell a friend. We're always wanting to grow and continuing to grow what is now this Hangout. So for my co-host, Connor Hope, I'm Brian Rauf. Thank you very much for listening and watching.
Basketball, college. Basketball, college. Oh, is that time already? Whoa, basketball, college. Come on. basketball college. Basketball college.